They called it a handoff. We called it a funeral for their war. The snow had been falling for 6 hours and showed no intention of stopping. Karef watched it come down through the fractured skylight of the derelict processing plant, fat flakes dissolving into the glow of the Vorkai heat signatures below. He didn't blink. He hadn't needed to blink in 17 minutes. That was the thing about the optic implant. It handled moisture on its own, a quiet little miracle of engineering that nobody back home would ever know about. Nobody back home knew about any of this. That was the point. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of his jaw. Not a nervous tick, just an old habit, the way some men touched a cross or a ring, and exhaled slow through his nose. Below him, 3 levels down through catwalks and collapsed flooring, and the skeletal remains of whatever this factory had once made, 2 Vorkai envoys were completing a transaction that would kill approximately 4 million people, give or take, depending on wind patterns over the Baltic coast. "Ghost lead, I have eyes on the second case," said a voice in his ear. Low, flat. The voice of a man who had stopped being nervous about things like this years ago. That was Briggs on Overwatch, belly down on a gantry 200 meters east with a railgun, stabilized against a rusted pipe. Confirmed 6 cylinders. Biosignatures read active. Repeat active. Copy, Karev said. He didn't say anything else for a moment. He looked at the cylinders through the scope of his crosscom overlay, watched them glow amber in the thermal display, each one a self-contained extinction event waiting for an address. Vasquez. Here. From the south entrance, she was already inside the wire, had been for 11 minutes, crouched behind a broken smelting frame the size of a small apartment. Her suit's adaptive camouflage flickered once, a shimmer in the air that a human eye would have missed entirely, that the Vorkai sensors would read as a drafting pocket in the atmosphere. She'd told Karef once that wearing the look felt like being the last thing in the room. He'd told her that was exactly what it meant to be. "Stay cold until I move the envoys," he said. "Understood." Holloway. A pause, then, "Count Calcium Tiles, boss. 12. They put the ugly ones up here, Chuck," the old name. The call sign everyone still used, because nobody wanted to say the number, the way the designation sheet printed it. Chuck was the best EOD operator in the unit, and possibly the most annoying human being Karev had ever met in his life, and he trusted the man with his life every single time, without question or pause. "Ready," Chuck said. No theater in it now. When the work was close, Chuck got quiet. That was how you knew. Karev studied the transaction below. 2 Vorkai, the envoys, stood at the center of the chamber in the particular stillness that their species adopted when concluding what they considered formful negotiations. They were tall. They were always tall. Their torsos arranged in that backward-bent posture that humans found unsettling until they'd seen enough of it to understand it was simply their version of straight. 3 mandibles folded at rest against the chest carapace, a gesture that translated roughly as concluded, as binding as done. Their translator devices hung at their throats like jewelry. The deal had been struck. Between them sat the case. Beside the case stood General Dmitry Sokolov, formerly of the 58th Combined Arms Army, currently of no army that existed on any official record, currently of the category of men who had decided that the collapse of one world order was simply an opportunity to shop their services to whoever was still ascending. He wore his old uniform without the rank insignia, which Karev had always found to be a particular kind of vanity. The costume kept, the accountability stripped. He was 58 years old and looked older, and was apparently unbothered by the fact that the things he was selling would outlast him by several centuries and a species. The man next to Sokolov Karev did not recognize. Mid-40s, civilian clothes, posture of someone who had spent a lot of time being important in rooms where everyone else was also important. He wasn't looking at the cylinders. He was looking at the Vorkai, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who has just made a decision that cannot be unmade, and is feeling, somewhere under the calculation, the faint nauseating weight of it. Good. Karev preferred targets who still had consciences. They hesitated. He moved. The adaptive cloak engaged as he dropped from the skylight access, and for 6 seconds he was simply a distortion in the cold air above the chamber floor, a shape that the Vorkai surveillance lattice read as thermal variance, as atmospheric noise, as nothing at all. He landed without sound on a catwalk 20 feet above the transaction and crouched completely still, watching the way one watches a clock that is also a bomb. The exchange of custody was nearly complete. One of the Vorkai reached for the case with its secondary appendage, the smaller pair below the primary limbs, finer fingered, built for precision, and popped the latches in sequence. The cylinders glowed dull amber in the overhead industrial lighting. 6 RSM pattern warhead cores, retrofitted for Vorkai delivery systems. The original casings had been human-made. That was the part that had kept Karev awake for 2 nights before this insertion. The part that none of his briefing documents had bothered to mark in red. Humans had made these. Humans had sold them once before, to different bad actors in a different failing decade, and now here they were at the end of the line. He tapped twice on his jaw. Vasquez moved first. She came up from behind the smelting frame in a low run, the cloak scattering her signature across a 12-meter radius. To any sensor, she was wind, she was heat ghost, she was the memory of something that had walked through this space 3 hours ago and left a thermal echo. She reached the South Transit access in 4 seconds flat, posted up, and in the same motion brought her weapon up to cover the left flank of the chamber. South clear, she breathed. Karev dropped. He didn't take the ladder. He rolled off the catwalk edge and caught the lower railing with one hand. The old grip, the practiced arrest of falling, and swung down to the chamber floor in a movement that was almost elegant if you didn't look at the tendons in his forearm. He landed in a crouch, 3 meters behind Sokolov, and the general didn't hear a thing over the mechanical hum of the Vorkai case lock cycling. The translator device at the nearest envoy's throat produced a sequence of tonal pulses, the Vorkai equivalent of a receipt confirmation. The deal in their language was recorded. Karev stood up straight behind Sokolov, pressed the muzzle of his sidearm against the base of the general's skull, and said in clean, precise Russian, "You're going to want to stay very still." Sokolov froze. The Vorkai envoys did not move. This was interesting. Karev had worked 6 operations against Vorkai affiliates in the past 18 months and had found them, universally, to be creatures of procedure. When procedure was disrupted, they paused. They didn't panic. They paused and reassessed, and then, if reassessment confirmed a threat, they became extraordinarily dangerous in an extraordinarily efficient way. The gap between the pause and the danger was about 4 seconds. Karev used 3 of them to step around Sokolov, keep the general between himself and the envoys as a physical interruption to line of fire, and bring his crosscom up to full active scan. The overlay flooded with data. The 6 cylinders read active. 2 of them showing elevated thermal signatures that meant armed, that meant on a clock, that meant Chuck needed to be moving right now. "Holloway," he said. "Already coming," Chuck said. The civilian, the man with the conscience, the man who'd made the unmakeable decision, turned and ran. Karev let him go. He'd been flagged for secondary extraction. That was someone else's problem in 20 minutes. One of the Vorkai envoys raised its primary appendage. The gesture in their grammar meant stop. But the secondary device, cycling up from beneath its chest carapace, meant something considerably less diplomatic. Karev had seen one of those devices discharge once in a compound outside what used to be called Minsk. The wall it had hit was no longer a wall. It was an absence of wall with structural consequences for everything nearby. "Vasquez," he said, "I see it." She fired twice from the south axis. The rounds were EMP-tipped, a design so new it didn't have a proper designation yet, just a project number and a sign-off from a woman in Maryland who'd apparently not slept in 11 months and had strong feelings about limiting collateral. The first round hit the envoy's chest carapace and collapsed the secondary device in a shower of component sparks. The second hit the translator at its throat and the room went acoustically strange. A low-frequency boom as the Vorkai communication lattice between the 2 envoys severed. The second envoy turned toward Vasquez. Sokolov chose that moment to elbow backward, which was the sort of decision that men like Sokolov always eventually made, and which Karev was always already accounting for. He stepped aside, let the elbow pass through empty air, and with his left hand pressed Sokolov's face firmly into the side of the nearest steel column. Not hard enough to kill. Hard enough to conclude. The general slid down the column and sat with the specific stillness of the temporarily unconscious. 6 cylinders, Chuck said from somewhere above, rappelling down a support line with the kind of confident speed that people who'd trained for a thing until it became reflex always showed. He hit the floor beside the case, popped his kit and had 2 gloves on and a diagnostic reader deployed before his knees had stopped bending. 2 armed. The rest are in standby mode. "I need 4 minutes. "You have 2, Karev said. "Then I need 4, Chuck said, which was the same answer he always gave. The second Vorkai envoy had made its reassessment. It turned for Vasquez, calculating her as the lesser threat, which was an error she was going to make them regret, and focused its sensor cluster on Karev. The cluster looked, to human eyes, like an arrangement of slightly iridescent patches across the upper cranial ridge. In function, it was more like a targeting system with philosophical implications. Every Vorkai Karev had ever encountered used it the same way. First categorize, then respond. He stood in the open and let it categorize him. A small, specific calculation. If he moved, it moved. If he held, it held. Vorkai decision trees had a well-documented preference for responding to movement over stillness. The Xeno-behavioral briefing packet had 17 pages on this particular characteristic. Kurev had read 4 of them on the transport, and retained what mattered. Hold still, and they wait for data. Give them data and they act, so he held still. Chuck worked behind him. The soft mechanical clicks of the disarmament procedure, the only sound in the chamber besides the snow, finding its way through the broken skylight, and the distant moan of industrial infrastructure long past its design life. One-armed, Chuck said, 40 seconds in. Still need 3 more minutes. The Vorkai envoy made a sound. A subsonic vibration that Karev felt in his sternum rather than heard in his ears. It was communicating, but the translator was dead. He had no idea what it was saying. In the absence of knowing, he defaulted to what he always defaulted to. He stood his ground and kept his face completely blank, and thought about his daughter's birthday, which was in 11 days, and whether he'd remembered to ask his sister to pick up the thing she'd asked for, the small illuminated globe with the continents in raised topography, that she liked to trace with her finger in the dark. He had remembered. He'd sent the message 3 days ago. The Vorkai envoy took 1 step forward. Briggs, from 200 meters east, put a railgun round through the upper corner of the envoy's shoulder carapace. Not a kill shot, a shot, which from Briggs was its own kind of extraordinary achievement since the man's natural setting was considerably more permanent. The envoy stopped, reassessed. Briggs, Karev said. Next one's different, Briggs said, in the tone of a man reading aloud from a menu. The envoy held. One-armed, Chuck said. 1 more and we're clean. 90 seconds. The exterior sensors lit up. Karev saw it in his crosscom overlay before he heard it. A bloom of movement signatures from the northern axis, organized, tactical, approaching fast. Not Vorkai standard military configuration. Something else. The suit's signatures were scrambled, reading as noise against the atmospheric baseline. He'd seen that before, once, in a briefing room with bad lighting and a satellite image that nobody in the room had been cleared to look at for more than 30 seconds. We've got company, Vasquez said. See them. Those aren't envoy security. No, Karev said. They're not. The Bodark came through the north wall. Not the door. The wall, which said something about their approach preferences and also about the structural integrity of this particular factory, in a staggered entry pattern that was almost perfectly mirrored from Ghost Insertion Doctrine. 7 of them, each one in a suit that bent light around its edges in that shimmering refraction that his unit's own cloaks produced, but different, the shimmer a half-beat off. The adaptation slightly rougher, as if someone had reverse-engineered the concept from a photograph rather than the engineering file. They were Russian special operations, or had been, and then they had become something that required a new vocabulary. In the 18 months since the Vorkai-backed consortium had begun recruiting from collapsed state militaries, the Bodark had been the unit Karev's people had encountered most. They moved the same way, they thought in the same geometry, they'd read from the same tactical playbook and then added components. The problem with fighting people trained identically to you was that every instinct you had about what they'd do next was also an accurate prediction of what they expected you to do. The firefight began. Karev dropped behind the steel column, where Sokolov still sat breathing through his nose, and put 2 rounds into the Kloso-Odark's knee joint. The one gap in the suit's protection that the design teams had apparently never fully addressed. A fact that had cost a lot of Bodark operators a lot of mobility across a lot of engagements. The operator went down. The others fanned, and the chamber filled with the compressed percussion of weapons fire echoing off 40 years of industrial steel. Vasquez moved. She was extraordinary when she moved. Not fast in the obvious way, not the kind of fast that looked like speed, but fast in the spatial way, always exactly where she needed to be and never where anyone expected, covering angles before the angles existed. She took 2 Bodark operators off their feet, with a sequenced flashbang and targeting burst that left their suit electronics singing in frequencies they weren't designed to process. Chuck did not stop working. This was the thing about Chuck that Karev had noted in 22 operations over 4 years. The man had a switch. In the world he was noise and humor and the kind of person who narrated his own actions at moderate volume. Inside the work, the switch flipped. He became the work. Rounds kicked up sparks 3 feet from his left hand, and he adjusted his grip on the diagnostic reader and continued the disarmament sequence without a single variation in the pressure of his fingers. 30 seconds, Chuck said. The drone came through the broken skylight. It was not a human drone. It was not even a Vorkai drone in the standard configuration. It was something built in the overlap space between the two technologies. A walking quadruped platform, 4 jointed legs, a central weapons mount that turned on a full spherical axis, sensor arrays that looked like compound eyes and functioned considerably better. It dropped through the skylight on stabilized descent jets, read the room in approximately 1.3 seconds, and oriented on the highest movement target, Chuck. Contact above, Briggs said, useless from his position. The sightline through the skylight from his gantry was obstructed. It's a Warhound, the upgunned variant. Thank you, Chuck said in the tone of a man who is aware of this. He didn't look up. He made the final connection on the last cylinder, disarmed. All 6. You're welcome. The Warhound fired. The round hit the case, not Chuck. Chuck was no longer behind the case, had moved the precise moment the diagnostic reader confirmed all clear, rolling left with a kind of unconscious grace that looked less like evasion and more like he'd simply decided to be somewhere else. The case took the hit. The case was designed for it. The cylinders held. That was the worst part of high-density weapon delivery systems. They were built to survive almost everything. Chuck came up from the roll with his sidearm in his hand and looked at the Warhound with an expression of professional displeasure. Okay, he said to no one in particular. Okay, Karev was already moving. He'd requisitioned the anti-armor launcher at the last resupply because the logistics officer had told him there was no reasonable operational scenario in which a 4-man ground unit would need anti-armor capability in an industrial infiltration context. And Karev had filled out the relevant variance paperwork citing previous operational experience as justification, which was bureaucracy's way of letting you say, I've seen things you wouldn't file a form about. He came up from behind the column, put the launcher on his shoulder, and shot the BMP-1 armored carrier that the Bodark had left running at the north axis into the Warhound at a combined velocity that the platform's stabilization system was not rated for. The Warhound went into the wall. The wall, already structurally compromised, expressed its feelings about this by contributing about 6 meters of itself to the new configuration of the chamber floor. Silence, not total silence. The particular silence of a firefight that has just ended, which still contains the percussion of the last few rounds, the settling of debris, the biological sounds of people taking inventory of their own bodies to confirm what's still working. Karev heard it before he finished the inventory, a sound. From the far end of the chamber he turned. The Bodark drone had been a distraction. He understood this in the same moment. He understood that he should have understood it sooner. And that the gap between those two understandings was where Chuck had been standing. Chuck was on the ground. He was breathing. That was the first thing Karev confirmed, because the first thing you confirmed was always breathing. The round had taken him in the left side, below the plate carrier, in the specific gap that suit designers had been trying to close since the first prototype, and had never fully managed. Because the human torso required movement and armor required rigidity, and these two requirements had been arguing with each other, since the first person had ever tried to cover themselves with something hard while still being able to walk. Karev reached him in 3 steps. He had a field kit in his left chest pocket, the compact version, the one that contained precisely what you needed and nothing you didn't, assembled by a logistics specialist named Torres, who had a theory that every additional item you packed was a second you'd waste deciding between options. Conscious, Chuck said, which was how Karev knew he wasn't as bad as it looked. Stay that way, Karev said. He worked fast. I got them all, boss, Chuck said. He said it quietly, without the theater, which made it mean something. All 6. I know. Just wanted it on record. It's on record, Karev said. Vasquez, I need an extraction window. Working on it, she said from somewhere in the rubble. A pause. The sound of something electronic being repurposed. There's a Ravens Rock transport inbound. 2 minutes out. They're going to take the case. They take the case over my body, Briggs said. They might try, Vasquez said. She wasn't being dramatic. She was being informative. Karev looked at the case. He looked at Chuck. He looked at the chamber's remaining exits. There were moments in every operation where the calculus had to run, and the result had to be accepted without sentimentality. The case contained 6 weapons that could kill 4 million people. Chuck was one person. The extraction window was 2 minutes. The transport inbound was carrying more Bodark or their equivalent. The north wall now had a new architectural feature. He made the calculation. He didn't like the result. He ran it again. Same result, Briggs, he said. New position, north approach, everything you have. A pause that contained a question. Now, Karev said. Briggs moved. Vasquez had already rigged the secondary explosives from the Bodark's own carried charges. She was meticulous about enemy equipment. Had been from the first operation Karev had run with her. Had a habit of saying your enemy's tools are already paid for in a tone that suggested this was obvious. The northern approach went loud before the transport could fully establish. The Raven's Rock helicopter came in low and magnetic, the extraction method of a unit that had stopped caring about subtlety. The magnetic cradle under the transport's belly was designed to lift the case without a ground team, without exposure, in and out in 11 seconds. Karev had seen the same system used once before in a briefing tape marked for his eyes. It was efficient. He respected efficiency even when it was working against him. He let it take the case. 2 cylinders, the armed ones, the ones that were going somewhere he couldn't follow. He let it happen and watched the transport rise through the broken skylight with the smooth, mechanical indifference of a machine executing instructions, and he thought, not today, not finished, not done. He filed the transport's heading in the back of his mind, behind his daughter's birthday globe, and the message he'd sent his sister, and the operational record that included the names of 6 cylinders, and a confirmation that all 6 had been disarmed. 2 had been rearmed. He knew where they were going. He had 9 minutes of observed flight pattern and a crosscom that had been quietly triangulating since the moment the transport cleared the skylight. He had the kind of certainty that isn't hope, that isn't optimism, that is simply the outcome of knowing your enemy's objective and knowing your own capabilities and sitting quietly with the arithmetic until it resolves. He helped Chuck up. Chuck made a noise that contained several opinions about the quality of recent events. You're buying, Chuck said. We'll see, Karev said. They moved toward the south exit. Vasquez was already there, already holding the door that had once been a security checkpoint and was now a frame around cold air and falling snow. Briggs materialized from the far side of the approach with the railgun over one shoulder and the particular expression of a man who has just moved very fast while carrying something very heavy and is choosing not to mention it. Karev stopped at the threshold. He looked back at the chamber, the warhound in the wall. Sokolov breathing quietly on the floor beside his column. The 6-cylinder case now somewhere above the cloud line. The Bodark operators, some still, some not. The ambient hum of the factory's remaining power systems, unchanged, indifferent. The electrical memory of industry that had been old before any of this had started. He thought about London. He thought about what the briefing maps had shown. Wind patterns, population density, the particular geometry of a city built over centuries that had no adequate architecture for what was coming. He turned away from the chamber. Whiskey 7, he said into the comm, using the call sign for command that meant immediate, that meant we are not done, that meant the operation has a second phase that you need to hear about right now. Slams grid. I need coordinates and a confirmation window. We have 2 active devices airborne, bearing north-northwest, 9 minutes elapsed. The clock is running. A pause on the command end. The pause of people running numbers. Copy, ghost lead. A different voice now. The kind of voice that existed in command structures for exactly these moments. Flat, fast, no inflection that would communicate anything other than we hear you and we are working. Slams is live. Feed us the triangulation. Karev pushed the crosscom data. He walked out into the snow. Behind him the factory stood with its broken skylight and its altered walls, and the evidence of the particular kind of work that never appeared in official records, and only happened in the spaces between the things that did. Chuck was limping. Vasquez had her hand under his right arm, not holding him up. He didn't need holding up. Just there, available, in the wordless way that people who've worked together long enough develop their own physical grammar. Briggs was already at the vehicle, had already started it, which was another thing nobody asked him to do, and which was done every time. Karev got in last. The radio crackled. Slams confirms target acquisition, the command voice said. 2 devices. Intercept in 40 seconds. London is green. He put his head back against the headrest. The vehicle was cold, running on whatever fuel the Bodark had left in it, and the heater worked at about 40% capacity, which was 40% more than most of his gear had been working for in the last hour. He thought about the civilian, the man with the conscience. Someone was picking him up right now. someone in a different vehicle, on a different route, running a different operation that would eventually become a different briefing file. He thought about what the man's face had looked like in that moment of completion, that faint nauseating weight. He hoped it got heavier. He hoped it became something that man carried every morning for the rest of whatever remained. "Boss," Chuck said from the back seat. "Quiet," the post-switch voice. "We got them all, right?" "The ones on the ground." "All 6 disarmed," Karev said. "And Slams gets the airborne ones. Slams gets them." A silence. The vehicle moved through snow-covered industrial roads, past structures that had been factories once, and then warehouses, and then nothing, past the particular grayness of post-industrial landscape at 4 in the morning. "My kid asked me once," Chuck said, "what I do for work." Nobody responded. This wasn't because no one was listening. It was because everyone was listening and nobody wanted to interrupt. "I told her I keep bad things from getting to good people," Chuck said. "She said that sounds hard." He paused. "I told her not really. You just have to be willing to be in the room." Karev watched the snow through the windshield. Somewhere above the cloud line, 2 missiles were making their case for the continuation of a city that had no idea any of this was happening, whose 4 million people were asleep, or working, or arguing, or in love, unaware that the specific reason they would wake up tomorrow with their plans intact and their families breathing was that a small number of people with no insignia had been willing to be in the room. He touched his jaw, the old habit, not a nervous tick, a reminder. "Next one," Vasquez said, which was what she always said at the end of operations, and which meant what it had always meant, that this was not the end, that Raven's Rock was still operational, that the 2 cylinders they hadn't been able to stop had been intercepted, but the architecture that produced them was still running somewhere, that the factory in this particular industrial wasteland would be one of 12 such locations, and they had addresses for 3 and working intelligence on 2 more, and the clock was the clock, and the work was the work. "Next one," Karev said. Briggs said nothing. He drove. He was always the one who drove, which was not in any official assignment document and had never been discussed. Some things in a unit like this settled into place by the natural sedimentation of repetition, the right person in the right role because the alternative had never once been tried. Chuck slept. Vasquez kept her hand near his side, monitoring. The medical kit was still open between them. London was green. The radio confirmed it twice. 42 seconds after the Slams acquisition call, 2 intercepts, both clean, both complete, no detonation, no casualties, no event that would appear in any morning newspaper or any online dispatch, or any conversation between ordinary people who had no idea how close the ordinary world had come to becoming something that required a different word. Karev closed his eyes for 30 seconds. This was the allowance he gave himself. 30 seconds in which he did not plan the next phase, did not review what had gone wrong, did not calculate the resources they'd lost, or the operational exposure, or the second phase implications of letting the Ravens Rock transport leave with the case. He thought about the globe, illuminated, continents in raised topography, his daughter tracing the edges of them in the dark. He opened his eyes. "Briggs," he said. "There's a secondary safe house at Grid 77 Alpha, medical rated." "Know it," Briggs said. "That's our next stop." "Copy." The snow kept falling. The factory disappeared in the rear view. Somewhere in the logistics pipeline of an operation that officially did not exist, a woman in Maryland who had not slept in 11 months was looking at satellite data with a particular expression. The intercept confirmation had just come through. She was looking at a map of London. She was looking at the population density models. She was calculating the delta between what had happened and what had nearly happened, which was a number that had too many zeros to feel real, and which felt entirely real. She wrote a single line in the after-action field of the mission report. "Unit performed." That was the entirety of the commendation. 3 words, no embellishment, no account of what specifically had been done in a factory, in the Chelyabinsk region, in the middle of a snowfall that nobody photographed. 3 words in a file that would be read by 7 people, and then classified at a level that required additional clearance to access the classification name. In 11 days, a man named Karev would sit in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and watch his daughter trace the raised topography of continents on an illuminated globe with her finger. She would ask him if he'd seen snow recently. He would tell her yes. She would ask him what it was like. He would think about the skylight, about the snow coming through in fat flakes and dissolving against heat signatures, about Chuck's voice saying, "I got them all, boss," in the quiet way that meant it. He would tell her it was cold and very quiet and very beautiful, And that was true enough. She would nod, satisfied, and trace another continent. He would watch her do it, and think about the specific debt that ordinary life owes to people who are never in the story, who are the reason the story keeps being possible, who are the room that gets entered so the room can stay standing, who carry work that has no name and leave it at the door of a kitchen that smells like coffee, and sit down at a table and ask their child what she learned today, and mean it, and listen. The snow kept falling over the Chelyabinsk factory for another 4 hours. By the time the sun came up, the drifts had covered most of the evidence. The structural damage would be attributed to material fatigue by whatever local authority eventually came to assess it, if any did. The body of Sokolov would be found 3 kilometers away, which was where a secondary extraction team had taken him, where he would eventually explain, in detail, everything he knew about Raven's Rock, in a room with better lighting than the factory, but considerably fewer exits. The 2 armed cylinders had never reached their destination. London woke up. 4 million people made coffee and argued about things and called their parents and sat in traffic and worked and hoped and planned. None of them knew. All of them lived.